While Russia threatens once again with nuclear weapons, Ukraine has used ATACMS ballistic missiles as well as Storm Shadow cruise missiles against Russian territory for the first time in this war. But we'll talk about this as well as about all the changes along the front line in this situation report about the war in Ukraine. For the first time since the beginning of the war, Ukraine has used ATACMS ballistic missiles against a target inside of Russia. It hit the town of Kurakhove in Bryansk, where an ammunition depot was situated. I checked where the location was, as in last situation report I reported what was until then said publicly, that Ukraine will only be allowed to strike inside of Kursk, but as this is in Bryansk, it was theoretically outside. But if we look at the overall picture, we see that it's still in a direct connection. We have the town of Karachev here, and if we go to the Ukrainian border, we see it's roughly 120 kilometers away from the Ukrainian border, and it's bordering Kursk. So this was likely an ammunition depot directly involved in the fighting in Sucha, roughly 200 kilometers south of it, and with a distance of 120 kilometers, it was barely outside of the range of GMLRS. The ATACMS strike hit an ammunition depot. Various secondary explosions were audible. The Russians said that the Ukrainians used 6 missiles. 5 of them were shot down and 1 was damaged, but it fell on a military installation that did not take damage. As said, the evidence is pointing to something else. Apparently, debris has once again hit something inside of Russia. So while this was a clear connection to Kursk, it is not a direct contradiction to what we've said before. So far, we do not see that an overall permission was given to the Ukrainians to strike outside of anything in direct connection towards Kursk. This might still change, obviously, that ATACMS can still be used somewhere else, but now fairly fresh, we have the report that Storm Shadow was also used against a target, this time in Kursk. The target is only 30 kilometers north of where the fighting so far has been. The strike hit the town of Marino, directly north of the border, just roughly 35 kilometers. The interesting part is that the town is really small, and according to reports, it has hit this installation, a former palace. The Russians were initially saying they hit a civilian target here, but it seems clear that this must have been some high-value target, because according to reports, the Ukrainians used 12 cruise missiles for a target this close to the actual border, which can only be explained if it was for some reason. So what high-value target was there is unclear. It might have been barracks filled with North Korean soldiers. It might be that here is some command staff filled maybe even with North Korean generals. We'll probably find out in the near future, but the attack was seemingly successful. There is a video circling around where you hear a series of strikes against a target at that point that was geolocated into the town here. We'll switch over to the developments in Kursk itself, and here we have the Russians continue to advance. We have the Russians first. We have the geolocation here at the town of at the town directly south of Novoivanovka. So the Russians have advanced roughly until this point here, and we have the Russians further advancing in the area of Pogrebki. We have them first to the west of it here. Let me quickly. We have them to the west of it here at Pogrebki. They took the area here, directly west of Pogrebki, and we have them already in the northern part of Malaya Loknia. The video that's the basis for the geolocation in Malaya Loknia shows that the Ukrainians have attacked Russian targets in the north of town, so the Russians have actually reached the town. Whether they gained a foothold inside of it is unclear, but at this point we can probably say that anything north of it cannot have any other substantial Russian Ukrainian presence anymore, with the Russians already operating down to here. The actual front line is probably maybe a little further north, but this area here should be more or less in Russian hands, or at the very least contested with no permanent presence by either side. The Russians are still claiming that Ukrainians are in that forest and are cut off and now and then try to break out but are being repulsed. But as of now, I do not see any evidence of this happening, so it's possible, but we don't have any further information. We'll see it probably in the future. So the Russians keep attacking and keep advancing inside of Kursk. No significant change though, even though the advance towards the south here is getting bigger and bigger. They are getting forward in this direction. There is no denying of this. Overall though, the Ukrainian lines are mostly still holding. We switch to the area of Kharkiv, and here we have a Ukrainian advance for a change. The Ukrainians managed to advance here north to that forested area. This is at this point here. So the end after being struck, there's infantry here being struck. This would indicate that at the very least this area is now contested, if not under Ukrainian control. So the actual Russian front line might be somewhere like this. It might be somewhat further north, but this forested area here is definitely no longer under solid Russian control as of now. We switch further east, as this was everything from Kharkiv. We move to the Eastern Front. Here we have no new information about the fighting in Kupiansk. There's a fresh video of Russian soldiers being taken prisoner here in the center of the town, but I do not see that this is something different from the video I mentioned in the last time. So I do not see fresh Russian presence here in the center of the town east of Kupiansk, or in the suburb of Kupiansk. We do have changes though in the area of Kolesnikivka. Here the Russians are advancing along the Oskil reservoir here towards the north. This is geolocated at this point, so they're getting closer in this area, slowly advancing further, and are increasing the pressure on the Ukrainians in this area. This is in connection to what Slatkov here says. Slatkov is a Russian military correspondent, and he's saying that the Ukrainian pontoon bridges over the Oskil are continuously being struck. The Russians clearly want to cut the Ukrainian lines of communication over the river. As said, in total there are only 2 bridges that have ever been there, and both have been attacked in the past. So we have the Ukrainians probably only using pontoon bridges in the area, and they are continuously being attacked. So the supply situation for the Ukrainians in this area is unclear as of now. According to Slatkov, they're already withdrawing towards the west, at least parts of them. We'll have to see how much of this is true. This, of course, Slatkov is a pro-Russian reporter reporting on this. So him saying that the Russians are successful has to be taken with a lot more caution than in other regards, than when a Ukrainian side would say that they are withdrawing towards the west. This was it though from the Eastern Front again. So not that much changing here in the north. In the south of the Seversky Donetsk, we have a Russian advance directly south of Bilohorivka. This is at this point, here. So we see them here reaching that forested area that is down here. The Russians have reached this point. Not a big change, but still advances that keep coming. Bilohorivka still under pressure here. Now the Russians might probably try to bypass it from the south, as Bilohorivka has been impossible for them to take over the past year and a half. They will probably now try what they're doing in the south to achieve a turning maneuver and thus bypass the fortifications of the Ukrainians. Further south, the Russians have slightly advanced at Orikhovo-Vasilivka, which we have here. Here we have a geolocation. As you can see, they have reached the outskirts of the town again. This should be roughly at this point here. So they've crossed the gray zone and have reached the first houses. Where the current front line is not fully clear, whether the Ukrainians managed to push them out again, but we see activity by the Russians here. Further south, we have the Russians gaining additional ground north of Chasiv Yar. Roughly this area is now fully under Russian control here. So they managed to extend their foothold on the other side of the canal directly north of Chasiv Yar and are increasingly being a threat to the northern parts of the town itself. Here in this area, the fighting is to be expected to intensify fairly soon. Further south, no changes that I can record until we reach the town of Toretsk, and here the front lines are moving fast. There's no other thing we can say about this. The last two geolocations are significantly further than we've seen them before. We had the Russians last time roughly here. Now we have them even further to the west. Let me start with the northern one. Now you see this is the stadium and they've already here. This is easy to find. These are the high rises and it's the road directly out of the town along that road roughly in the middle. So they have reached roughly this point already on the town, and in the southern part they have reached the western part of this part of town here of the quarter. So they are at this point here. To which degree the quarters are taken now is obviously your guess is as good as mine, but something like this seems to increasingly be realistic. Whether this means it's an advance like this or whether all of this has already fallen would be pure guesswork, but we see the Russians making massive gains inside of Toretsk over the past 2 days. Further west in the area of Pokrovsk, I actually do not have any significant change in territory. Now they might have gained something here north of Yurivka, maybe a tree line here from what I've seen, but I do not see any significant changes. But further south in the Kurakhove direction, it is changing though. Here we have the Russians being on the southern side of Sonsinivka already. This is geolocated here. So they are only 3 kilometers away from Stary Terny, which would cut off all the Ukrainians still inside of this. This pocket here is increasingly being pushed in from the east. The Ukrainians lose additional positions here in the east, and Beretsky is now fully occupied, as well as the whole coastline. This is being confirmed, and obviously the pressure towards Kurakhove from the north is also increasing. The Russians are also inside of Kurakhove, have advanced to a certain degree. We see this here fairly easy to identify. This is the last row of houses before the river passes here, and which means the Russians are now at this point as well. Probably all of this should be considered to be under Russian control already. The Russians also gained the area northeast of Dalnie this year, also increasing the pressure towards Kurakhove here, even though in this direction is probably not critical yet. Here in the east, the Ukrainians are withdrawing from the areas roughly north of Antonivka. So this here is currently being evacuated and already to a certain degree being occupied by the Russians, while the Ukrainians are under pressure from the south as well. For instance, Trudove, we have fresh geolocations of Russian operations in here. They're close to Uspenivka and to Konstantinopolske, which both would cut the lines of communication for all those towns here. So we'll have to see how long they will be able to hold out. The Russians also gained some territory west of Yasna Poliana. This is roughly this area has been occupied by the Russians now as well. They gain additional ground in this direction as well. That was it already with the territorial changes. The clear focus of the Russians is Kursk and Kurakhove, and this is basically what we have in the summary as well. The US are now thinking that 11,000 North Korean soldiers are already in Kursk. This is the highest number so far, and there are additional reports about further redeployments of Russian forces and Russian equipment towards Kurakhove. So we see the Russians increasing the pressure here. I said it in the last situation report that it would make perfect sense for the Russians trying to force a decision here, as not only can they encircle probably several thousand soldiers, depending on how big the pocket would be if they can close it, but also it's more difficult for the Ukrainians to build additional fortifications, as the front line is moving faster than usual in these regions, and they obviously need time to build fortifications. So for them, it would be a choice to either build them close to the front line where they won't be finished, or build them significantly further back, meaning they will lose a lot more territory that isn't fortified until their soldiers have that well-built fortification again. So the Russians here see a window of opportunity, and we clearly see them intending to use it, both in Kursk, where they want to push the Ukrainians out probably until Trump's inauguration to deprive Ukraine from a bargaining chip in future negotiations, as well as they want to succeed here. Now we have fresh rumors in Ukraine. The State Department is warning that they expect a big air attack on Kiev today. The rumors right now are, both from Russian as well as from Ukrainian side, that Russia might use an intercontinental ballistic missile against the city of Kiev. Now, while this is usually a nuclear weapon or a ballistic missile for nuclear weapons, this is not expected that we don't expect Kiev to be nuked at this point. What they will likely use, if the claims turn out to be right, is an RS-23, which is a MIRV capable ICBM with a range of 6,000 kilometers, so multiple independent re-entry vehicles, usually a nuclear weapon, with a warhead of 1.2 tons, metric tons here. The missile itself is fairly modern. It was developed in the 2000s, but it was never put into service. So this would be more like a weapons test, or the usage of a weapon that is not meant for regular deployment in this context, very likely with a conventional warhead here. The CEP is being considered to be at 150 meters. This is fairly accurate for an atomic weapon, and more than accurate enough, but it clearly shows if it's fired at a city of several million inhabitants where military targets exist, but they are fairly close next to civilian target, that would be pointless if you aim to hit a military target. So if this missile is actually being shot towards the city, it would most likely cause significant civilian damage, as the warning time would be very low and the warhead is bigger, while the kinetic impact of the missile's warhead itself would also be would cause damage due to the high speed and high weight itself as well. So we see that Russia might actually use a big liquid-fueled missile here against the Ukrainians. I was just confused. So the first stage is solid fuel. The last stage can have liquid fuel, it's unclear. But if this missile is being used, the RS-26 here, RS-26 Rubesh, it would clearly be a further escalation, but we have to see it in the context of the ATACMS use. That would be the most likely reason, basically to show the Ukrainians we can do more damage to you than you can do to us, and also obviously to send a sign towards the west, because Western satellites would see the launch and it would look like the launch of a regular ICBM. Just in this case, it would not have a nuclear warhead. Now, this comes in connection to the same time as Russia has announced it's changing its nuclear doctrine. This is mostly irrelevant. Basically, they are saying if a weapon is attacking us with non-nuclear weapon, with conventional weapons, but they are allied with somebody that has nuclear weapons, then we consider this to be an attack by both of them, and that we reserve the right to use nukes. These doctrinal change obviously are saber rattling, meant to deter the West. They should mostly be ignored, because from Russia's side, the usage of nuclear weapons will be dependent on the Russian leadership, not on the doctrine. The doctrine is meant to publicly state where, at which point they are using it. And for Russia to use nukes, they need to have a cost-benefit analysis. And for them to use them now, it simply makes no sense. They would gain a military short-term advantage on the battlefield, obviously, but the long-term implications would be so devastating that it doesn't make sense for Russia to use it, no matter what their doctrine says, at least at this moment. Now, things can always change, obviously, but until Ukraine is seriously threatening them on the battlefield, and unless the West gets involved seriously, my personal fear of a usage of nuclear weapons by the Russians is minimal. The important thing here is this is a sign if they're actually using a nuclear capable missile against Kiev. This is a sign towards the West and towards the Ukrainians. This could have been a nuke. This is in context with the changing of the nuclear doctrine, but we have to understand there is no automatic mechanism. It's not like they have to use nukes just because they changed the doctrine. They will still only use the nuke when their president, when Putin says it's the right thing to do, and there is no rational reason why Putin should do that now. Then we have news from the Baltic Sea. Denmark has taken the Yipeng 3. This is a bulk carrier, civilian ship that is Chinese. It was close to when the cables in the Baltic Sea were damaged each and every time. The German government is currently thinking it was sabotage, that the cables were damaged, and the ship was close every time it was damaged. And interestingly enough, the captain of the ship is a Russian citizen. This is not a proof of anything yet. The Danish have made sure that they can't flee anymore. They have taken the ship and taken it into Danish waters, and now we'll see what comes out of this. We'll have some information about troop generation from Ukraine too. Zelensky said in a speech that Ukraine has already produced 2.5 million shells for artillery and mortars in 2024. This is obviously more than we've heard from the West, but we have to understand that it includes mortar shells, which are far easier to produce. And obviously a 60mm mortar shell takes a lot less resources and it is a lot easier and cheaper to produce than a 155mm shell, especially as mortars do not have the inertial rotation to stabilize them. This means that they use less metal, that they need less details in it, less thick materials, and thus it makes them lighter and easier to produce, and thus obviously the volume that can be produced is much higher. But still 2.5 million shells being produced by the Ukrainians until this very moment is a fantastic news. That's 200,000 shells basically a month, even a little more than this, that the Ukrainians are producing for themselves in addition to the aid they're getting from the West. He also said that for the next year 3,000 cruise missiles as well as 30,000 long distance drones are being planned. Those numbers obviously sound fantastic, especially as it's unclear what he means with cruise missiles. Do we talk about the Neptune that will carry a warhead of several hundred kilos, or do we talk about the so-called rocket drone, which is like a mixture of drone and cruise missile, where the warhead is in the 2 digits, in the mid 2 digits? This is unclear as of now, but 3,000 cruise missiles would be a fantastic number, and a number that would actually dwarf the Russians. So we are probably talking about smaller weapons than the Russians are using at this time, but still good news, especially in addition to 30,000 long-distance drones. The defense budget for the Ukrainians is also announced for next year. That's 54 billion US dollars, and 17.9 billion are aimed for the domestic defense industry, also showing how much the Ukrainians are going to build weapons. Then we have news from international aid. The Biden government has will give the Ukrainians anti-personnel mines. Those are mines that are destroying themselves though, so not regular anti-personnel mines that are being set up in the ground for people to walk over this, but mines that have a timer, and once the timer has run out, they destroy themselves. The most likely usage here is the ATACMS, the area denial artillery munition. That's a 155mm shell, or shell I think has per definition explodes, so a 155mm projectile that has 36 mines in it, and there are two types. In one case, the mines are disabling themselves or destroying themselves after 48 hours, and the other one within 4 hours. So it's just in case an attack is being expected, they can shell. It's not for permanently mining. The system there apparently is in a way that it needs electricity for the mines to work. So if the battery runs out, the mine is inert and can't even be exploded anymore. That's the way they are supposedly designed. And from Denmark, we have the news that they've handed over 6 F-16. In total, they want to give the Ukrainians 19, so more F-16s have arrived inside of Ukraine. And finally, we have something where the Ukrainians do their own innovation. Now, this shows us how FPV drones are being employed far outside of their usual range. We see that they basically have developed a carrier plane that is flying here with 2 FPV drones mounted on it, and it's carrying them deeper into the territory. We see one was dropped, and you can see the image here where it is looking for a target and has already found one and is going to strike at it. And the second one is about to launch as well. And it has stabilized and is now going to look for a target as well here in this regard. Interesting is that it already has low battery warning. No, now it turned off. And you can see that they were able to apparently decide whether or not this target is destroyed or not. And this is somebody asking me for food. So I think it's about time for me to end today's situation report. If you like this situation report, then please give it a thumbs up. It really helps with the algorithm. If you're new here, I would like to invite you to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon. And obviously, I expect some comments about cats in the comment section, and I'm always happy to read them, because this is Siegfried. I don't think you've seen him lately. Usually it's just Etzel in the basket behind me. But anyways, if you enjoyed this, I would really appreciate the thumbs up, the subscription, and the comments, obviously. And this channel is only possible because of the support of viewers like you. If you like to support the channel, you can do so by the means in the description. But that's it from me for now. Thank you for watching, and I'll be back.